Welcome to our Women in Leadership webinar. I'm your host, Lorraine Stutzman-Amstutz, Denominational Minister for Peace and Justice for MCUSA, and happy to be with you all today. I'm joined by some of the Women in Leadership Steering Committee members, 3 of them. Sue Park-Her is the Director of Racial Ethnic Engagement for MCUSA. Abby Endeshaw is the Summer Service National Coordinator for Mennonite Central Committee, and Shannon Dykes, Vice President for Student Affairs, Equity, and Belonging at Eastern Mennonite University. And just as importantly, Shannon is the keynote speaker for our Women in Leadership Summit, which will be held on July 8 in Greensboro. And we are all thrilled to have Shannon in that role for us. Just a few logistic notes. Today's gathering is in webinar format, which means all attendees are muted and the chat is disabled. We will, however, be posting some links in the chat that you'll be able to see. Spanish interpretation is available, and you can use, I think there's a more button. If there's not a little globe at the bottom of your screen, there's a more button, and you can, it says interpretation and a picture of a globe there. This webinar is also being recorded, and you will receive the link in a follow-up email. And our webinars are also available on our YouTube channel. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Only the panelists will be able to see those, and we'll monitor those and hopefully have time to answer questions. And some of you have already sent in questions, which we appreciate, and hopefully we'll have opportunity to answer those as time allows as well. I want to open our time together in prayer. Please join me. Loving God, creator of all people made in your image, we know that for too long we've often fallen short of the ideal that we are all worthy and whole in your eyes. We acknowledge that systems of oppression have often been upheld by the church and diminishes the voices of those you love. We seek courage to unlearn the ways of patriarchy in our lives and embrace the liberating work of your Spirit. Strengthen us for the work, sustain our spirits, and make us co-creators with you in a community where all are seen, valued, and called forth in the fullness of our gifts. In your name we pray. Amen. So I want to have us start Sue as the longest serving member of the steering committee and previous staff person for the steering committee. If you want to just tell us a little bit about the history and the purpose of Women in Leadership and how it started, just to give us that perspective.
Well, I don't know if I am the longest running. I think Shannon is, but no, you're denying it. Okay, it's hard to believe because yeah, COVID years just kind of warps your understanding of time. And I could talk about women in leadership, but before it was called a Women in Leadership Project. Some of us have been here for a while, understand this, and we can go back to 1973, MCC Peace Section, if you're familiar with that journey. And even in 1992, when Mennonite Central Committee hosted a Women Doing Theology conference, even back then. But really, I think under MCUSA, we can start with the 1995 survey of men and women in ministry, and how, and under direction of Diane Zaire Bennerman, they really wanted to see how women who are called into ministry, what are some of their experiences, what are the men's experiences, where are the differences, and they really took on that survey seriously. And some of the findings were surprise. There were some structural and attitudinal gender inequalities, finding appropriate leadership and ministry styles that differed and that were valued differently, how women and men balance ministry, family, and other roles differently, and how to set up appropriate boundaries. Those are some of the themes that came up with some recommendations that are on our MCUSA Women in Leadership page. So if you want to know more about that survey and the findings, they are still there. So in 2000, that was 2005, and I could do a whole history of this, the best that I know. I don't know it too well, but in 2009, Mennonite Women USA called for an audit of women in leadership in Mennonite Church, and with the findings of 2005. And when the results require that there is a need for systemic change, MCUSA staff was tasked to do the work of women in leadership as we know it. And in 2012, MCUSA formed a Women in Leadership Steering Committee, which now Shannon, Abby, and I are part of. But it was spearheaded by Joanna Shank and Hilary Scarcella. Some of us know them well. Shout out to them and the deep work that they did. And really, when they were beginning this, they really wanted to center the voices of women with intersectional identities, particularly BIPOC women. And so from the beginning, they recognized that we need to create space where we are not, that we are in the center of this movement that we're trying to create, because so many of our organizations were not created with women in ministry in mind, with women of color in ministry in mind. And so that was very intentional in the ways that they structured women in leadership. And then, yeah, they came together and in 2013 began to meet to recognize that we need to, how do we support women in ministry, and what are the barriers that we're facing. And so centering on the experience of women of color and the most marginalized, they said, if we try to create space where the most marginalized and most vulnerable group in ministry are uplifted, it'll lift us all up. And so they try to create space for conversations, to create places where women can actually have platform to speak about their experiences. And then after, you'll see that under Jenny Castro, and again, shout out to Jenny and the important work that she has created, we kind of began and picked up the Women Doing Theology conferences. And some of us have been to some of those. All You Need Is Love in 2014, 2016, I've Got the Power, and then 2018, Talking About a Revolution, talking about the systemic issues that pertain to women and the lived experiences of all of us. Under Jenny, there was also a podcast that was launched called Holding It Together. And you'll see that theme kind of reverberate in the theme that we are also going to be we'll be talking more about at the conference, Be Holding It Together. It comes from the conversation about our podcast. And then during the pandemic, we had an online Women Doing Theology conference called What You Need Is Laboring Towards Wholeness. No, What You Need Is Here, sorry. What You Need Is Here, or what, and then we also launched the Laboring Towards Wholeness curriculum during the pandemic. And so that is a long story of, and I hope I captured a bit of it so that you guys know how this was all started.
Thank you, Sue. Whenever I hear the story or read about it, it always, I think it just fills me with hope and inspiration to know that this space is provided. And I think that's what we certainly hope and want to continue throughout the work of what the steering committee is doing, and certainly thinking about the summit on July 8 of the space that we want to create. And I also just want to say, before I forget that well, today we're talking about some about that and also some about women in leadership in particular around the steering committee and who you all are, that we are also going to have a follow-up webinar on April 24th where some of the panelists from that will be at the summit with us on July 8th will also be speaking. So we'll be talking more actually about the summit then as well. So I want to just follow up, Sue, that kind of history with asking each of you just to speak to what inspired you to say yes to joining the steering committee. Because I again, it's a volunteer position. It can be heavy work. It can be a lot, and you're doing this in addition to everything else that you're doing. And so why this? Why join the Women in Leadership Steering Committee? So I'll just let each of you respond to that. Maybe start, how about if we start with Shannon and then Abby and then Sue?
Sure. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. Sue, I appreciate the naming of the story. Like, it's important to tell the story of how things began. And I got excited about women in leadership for a couple of reasons. First, because Lorraine, you just used the word hope when you hear the story. I also think about the word courage um, for a couple of reasons. When I joined several years ago, the group of women who are part of the steering committee were some of the most courageous women in ministry that I had seen. And so I was like, wait a minute, I get to be a part of a group of women who are thinking together and planning together and just supporting each other in ways that I know is important for our sustainability in ministry. And we get to think about what we want to offer to the church and for the church. And so it was about joining into this kind of narrative of courage that had already been designed and allowed. I hear the larger story of women in leadership as the church saying there is systemic inequality. And there is an important place for identities that have not been listened to, that have not been heard, to speak boldly. And so every time we get together, like we echo that like we get to speak boldly, and there's a fire, there's an urgency, there's an energy in that has been that has carried all along. And so that's what has held me and sustained me along the way in our work together.
Yes, thank you, Shannon. I appreciate the word courage, the boldness of the members of this group. Many of us are taking making courageous moves, taking risks in our day-to-day work. And so the space has also been a place of rest for me. I think I joined with curiosity, I joined with openness, I joined with a desire to just contribute to a community that I care about. These women, the Mennonite Church, and I also a desire to represent um, underrepresented groups and identities and wanting to just continue to be a part of the story. Um, yeah, and it's been a joy so far. It's a work of exploration and self-reflection of what's the work to be done and what's my role in it. But it's a team that has been very welcoming and fostering of like my own gifts.
I think Lorraine said that I kind of came on as staff for MCUSA, and so I kind of helped to facilitate this space in the beginning. And I decided to stay on because, like Abby said, and as Shannon said, it was a place where I met badass women in the church, and also a place of exhale. I was able to decompress, like, am I crazy? Like when I am in certain situations and I'm like, did I see that right? And there are others who will be like, yep, you saw that right, or no, and it was just a place where I could um learn and to also recognize my place in it, sharing my perspectives as well. One of the most formative time for me in this space as a committee member was during COVID. We met on almost every other week to check on each other. And we had so many different people of different, in different social locations. And so Shannon, I don't know if you remember, but we would get together and we would talk about the impact of COVID, where we are, like in time, in live. And we could see that certain places, people were not impacted. It was just, they can stay in their own space. There are people where their community is falling apart. Elders are dying every week. There are others like me who experienced anti-Asian hate and how that impacted my friends and my elders. There were just like, we talked about, going to the board. I mean, there were just so many amazing stories, so that even though we were kind of in our silos and we were all, you know, we needed to be quarantined, I learned so much from that experience, that these systemic realities that where we're at really impact lives, and it impacts women. And so I learned so much from that, and I continue every time we meet. I feel like I learned so much beyond, and that I can also contribute to that space. So it's been an enriching place, and that's why I'm still here.
Thank you all. I know that we don't always look forward to all the meetings that we get to be part of in our lives and work, but I can honestly say that being with the Women in Leadership is something that I look forward to, and I always feel like I come out of that feeling kind of fulfilled in different ways. It's life-giving, not soul-sucking. So I have always appreciated that. But thank you all for your responses. I want to switch now, and I want to talk about the mission of Women in Leadership. So the mission statement of Women in Leadership says, we will work to dismantle patriarchal systems in Mennonite Church USA by empowering women to live out the call of God in their lives, increase their capacities, and contribute their wisdom in congregations, area conferences, agencies, and institutions. So maybe just, and you've already done that some, in just talking about kind of your inspiration for joining, but what would you say, this is important for the church for what reason, and where do you see it happening? So if maybe I'll start with Abby on this one, and then Sue or Shannon, if you want to add to that in that order. But Abby, let's start with you.
Yes. Yeah, I'm so inspired by this mission. And I think patriarchy is sometimes hard to define, and sometimes it can feel limiting, the word patriarchy, because we think of patriarchy and we think about like wage inequality, and it's that and it's more. And so in my work, I work as the summer service national coordinator at MCC, Mennonite Central Committee. And that's a program that's invested in young adult leadership development. And so a highlight of the work for me is to really deconstruct the idea of what is a leader, and to really like look at the ways that sometimes like patriarchy is really embedded in our culture and tells us what a leader is. That a leader is an individual, a leader is strong physically, strong in their voice, that they are very dominant or domineering. And so taking that time to really deconstruct what a leader can be and is liberating, I think, for people of all genders that I work with, to see, okay, who has God made me to be? What are my giftings? And how can I create a space in my community where I welcome that in myself and I welcome that in those around me, so that we're not limiting one another.
Amen. All of that. I mean, even when I'm looking at the 1995 2005 survey. That's, they're talking about power versus empowerment, right? How do we use our power? So some of these themes that we still struggle with are very resonant, even when we are looking at our church and even just the current realities of where we are right now as a nation. I really just look at our scripture to guide us, right? If we say that Christ is our peace and he's broken down the walls of hostility, if we look at the scripture in Galatians, or we are all children of God and we belong to Christ, and so there's neither Gentile, Jew and Gentile, slave or free, men and women, like, how does that look? What does that look like when we talk about, um, women doing theology? What does that look like really in the church? And I think it's really important for us to not say these in a conceptual way, but how does that look like in the church, in the life of people in the church? And so I think that's what guides me, and how this shows up and how I see progress in the way that these kinds of accountability and real concrete ways of how I think women in leadership has contributed is, for example, Mennonite Church USA, our executive board, right now we have 8 women and 7 men. We have more women in these strategic spaces of leadership. We have in our executive board staff, where Lorraine and I are part of, we have 4 men and we have 13 women on staff. Like that is done with intention. Our conference ministers in June, we're going to have 15 women and 14 men. Like these are concrete, accountable things that matter. That's not the only answer, but these are ways that we can really see how much we have moved and how much the needles continue to stay and also to move. And so I think those are places where I see real concrete ways that we try to be the church.
Yeah, I agree. In this stream of what Abby, I'm sorry, and Sue have both offered. Some of my colleagues here at EMU have said I've just gotten through with a Mennonite tour. I did the Mountain States Conference and keynoted also at Ohio Mennonite Conference and have spoken at Bethel College all in the last like 3 or 4 weeks. And whenever I speak, I start with an introductory slide that has whatever title, has my name, and then I very specifically name like what parts of myself have influenced the content of where I'm going. And so sometimes it's that that I'm an educator, and sometimes that it's I'm a woman of color, and sometimes it's that I'm a spiritual director, and those influence parts of what I bring. And in every single one of those instances of where I've spoken over the last couple of weeks, there is a woman that has come up to me afterwards and said something about how she can recognize her identities in what she heard, in the ways that we had conversation and in the ways that we're showing up to each other. And I say that to say, like, I'm able to do this because of the courage that we build together. I don't go out. I'm not confident enough to do this on my own. It's in the energy and the wisdom and the trust that I know, the support that I know that I have in other women who are just as courageous as me every single day in so many other spaces that I can show up. And it's in our networking to one another that we can show up in congregations and in conferences and on campuses and say, I'm a woman with something bold to say, and I'm going to say it, and I'm going to encourage you to do a bold thing. And it's in the practice of that we're able to just really actively stand to patriarchy and then to multiple forms of oppression that really are seeking to silence us, to allow us to be unseen. But when we keep showing up and naming who we are and knowing that we can trust in the support that we get from one another, like that begins to move through our systems and move through our bodies in ways that are really important.
I love all of that. I think one of the themes that I hope anyone attending today or listening to this later feels in particular is that you are not alone. Because I think that's what I hear from you all, and that it takes that. Or else, Shannon, like you said, you don't have the confidence to do it on your own, like all of that, because it can be all the things can make us feel like we're not worthy. And so to be able to hear you all speak and to be able to have that message be there for women that you are not alone, I think is so significant. So I also want to think as you all talk about this, we know that it's difficult work. And so I do want to just bring us to thinking about the one-day summit where we talk about the theme of beholding. Sue alluded to that earlier with the podcast of holding it together, so that we talked about beholding. And so as a group, we spent time together developing the theme, thinking about what we wanted that one-day summit to be. Thinking about power, but also thinking about an emphasis on rest as a significant part of the work of undoing patriarchy. So maybe if you can each talk about what you think about when you think about the summit and the theme that we've developed. So maybe we start with Sue and then Shannon and Abby.
Well, I think the last time that we met to have this conversation about planning, we were in LA, near Pasadena, where I live, and some of you know, and most of you know, that we have gone through the fires, the wildfires here. And I didn't know how important our theme would be at that time of beholding it together. So I keep on thinking about our theme because it's like holding it together, beholding it together, together, holding, like all of these themes have really, I'm learning what that means for me at such a time. And more than anything, there's so much work to be done right now in our community. And there's so much scrambling of trying to get resources to help each other. And we need rest in all of the chaos that we are, and a lot of the displacement that we feel right now. And I think it's not just here in Pasadena. I think this is how we're feeling in many of our spaces. And to create space for us to exhale together. As Shannon, before when we even got together, we said, it's just like, we want this webinar to be just us sitting around the table in a living room and just hanging out, you know. I think we need that. I think we're so right now on this fight flight mode of just like, what do we need to do? And I think we just need to like exhale together and to know that we can feel safe, and to move slowly together. And I think for a lot of women, it's really hard for us to rest. My daughter tells me, she goes, Mom, I learned everything from you except to rest. And that really, that really pained me to recognize that, my gosh, I don't know how to rest. And so this practice of doing this together, I think will be important for me, and to show up in that posture will not be easy, but I will try as we also plan that together.
Yeah, thank you, Sue. When we were together and putting together the theme for this summit, we tried to imagine what we would need at this point in time. And I think what stands out for me the most is what we are trying to create is in resistance to all of the cultural impetus to react to everything that's going on right now. That as women, there is an expectation for us to react and to respond to what's happening in the world in a specific way, and for us to show up with the things that we always show up with. And Mennonites, in the culture of being Mennonite, we always want to jump in and start doing some stuff. in response and in reaction to what's happening in the world. And our leaning into beholding is us saying, wait a minute. What does it mean when we sit down together? What does it mean when we listen to what each other is bringing as we sit down? And then how do we hear God for what we are to do? Because there's stuff to do, but how do we listen together first and know that we are empowered differently in our listening together than we would be than if we just reacted and responded in all the ways that culture is telling us to do. And so this is, I think it's coming out of hope and prayer that we really are working in the rhythm of God to be in the wisdom of what can sustain us for a long period of time, and not just some of us, but all of us. And so how do we sit down and do that listening together?
Yes, yes, yes. I agree with all that you guys have captured really well the intention and um and maybe like a bit of the premonition or the prophecy of what we imagined this time could be like and what we would need. And I think I also want to affirm that um the the core vision of women in leadership and of the steering committee and all who are participating, we want to see the change in the world happen. That's for sure. We want to go somewhere together. And when Sue was sharing about the different events, it's been quite some time since we have gathered together this women doing theology, women in leadership. And so the question is absolutely, we are taking a beat to rest, which is important to sustain the long work of resistance. And also, who's on our team? Because not, and we don't want anyone to burn out. We want to work in this together. We want to strategize together. And so there's definitely there's the rest, there's the reflection, there's the gaining power by listening to God, by knowing who you are, and just wanting to emphasize also like, and who are we in it with? Who's our team? How can we work together to get there?
I just wanted to add also just the reality that this time when we meet, it is just for a day or half. I mean, it's like such a short time. I mean, we were talking about all kinds of themes, right? We wanted to talk about power. We wanted to talk about all kinds of, issues that we feel is important, but also to recognize the limited time that we have, the importance of physically being together, as Abby mentioned. I think that was really important, and to like behold each other's face too, and to say like, it is good to see you. And whether they're old friends or they're new to what we do, we really want this space to be a place where we can say, welcome, sit down, drink something with us, and let's just enjoy each other's company. I think that's important for us to begin in that way.
Thank you, each of you, for speaking to that. I think remembering when we first started planning for this summit, that we did start very much in that the power, like we have to address it, we have to answer all the things. And then after, during our final day together was when we finally said, oh my word, this is going to be exhausting, not just for us, but for everyone, and that's what we do. It's that doing, Shannon, that you talked about. This is what, we get together, we know what the work is, and so we plan to do it. And then you realize there's a lot more that we also need, like we talked about. How do we be together? How do we make sure everyone's needs are being met? How do we make sure we're not just leaving people behind? How do we gather together and build relationship? Because that's so significant for any of the work that we do if we are not allowing people to build that relationship first. So I appreciated the process. I appreciated how you each talked about it. Thank you so much. I want us to we do have some time, so I want to look at some of the questions that were submitted. Thank you for those who submitted those. for some of them. I just want you to know that we would be together for the next day or so if we could fully really answer them, but we'll see where we go with them. One person asked, how can women work at dismantling patriarchy and naming misogyny along with anti-racism, LGBTQIA plus inclusion, etc. work? How do we do it? It's that question, isn't it? How do we do it all? Anyone want to respond to that one?
So this is a big question, but I'll start. Um, um, so much of this, and I think I'm gonna reflect just some of the lessons and the sisterhood that we have built in women in leadership. So much of this starts with us being able to like allowing folks to show up whole and saying whatever parts of yourself are true, like bring them, and we will hold them, we will honor them, we will listen with them, like and it's in our fragmenting of our identities of you can be a woman but you can't be a woman of color, or you can be a woman of color but you can't be queer and a woman of color, or in our desire to make people fragment themselves, like we allow some of the intersections to not work together. But when we let folks show up in all of their identities and in all the ways that is true and gray some days, and that gives each other permission to then see each other whole and then begin to name what experiences we are having because of our identities. And that's the start of the work in actually responding to misogyny and patriarchy when we allow ourselves to see each other whole.
Yes, yes. Um, for me, what comes to mind is how do we do this work? We do it together. And I think of a book I've read called Abuelita Theology by Kat Armas. And it's a book that talks about how when we think of the spiritual leaders in our life, we're taught to think of it really from a patriarchal lens. We see those that are doing the writing, that are doing the speaking, and that have positions of power and authority. That's who are our spiritual leaders. But of course, we're wanting to, but when we really have a full view, the people who are practicing and modeling spiritual practices in Kat Armas's life, it's the abuelitas, the people who are doing the cooking, the people who are doing the hosting, the people who are doing the welcoming. What do we have to learn when we view them as our spiritual leaders? And so when we think about the work that we have to do to respond to the racism and the homophobia and the misogyny, when we think of all that work, I think we're drawn to resistance that's very maybe masculine, or it's the fighting, it's the just like something raising your fist, it's the protest. And so to me, I say yes to all of that. And if we widen the view, what are the other ways that we're really practicing the dismantling of systems of oppression? And I think of the relationship building. It's the going for coffees. It's those of many of you who are um, like the breakfast at church, the donuts, the coffees, the people who are putting in the legwork to make community feel tangible, to make people feel welcome. And when we're doing it together, um, we can get there. We can get there together. It's like that's where the networking happens. That's where the coalition building happens. That's where we may not have the loudest voice, but we can get there faster when we're together. So that's where I would expand our view to of the relationship building.
I totally agree. And what you're saying, Abby, reminds me of our gathering at Hope for the Future a couple of weeks ago. That the reason why we do this work is radical love. It's not to fight systems for the sake of, it's deeply, it has to be deeply rooted in radical love, and to recognize that this is not oppression Olympics. We are not trying to, make this be more important. And that's why I think what Shannon said is so important. It is bringing our whole selves to recognize that we are vulnerable. We all hold different vulnerable identities, and that we need to tend to them together. And so, and I love what Tulani said as well, that we so sometimes work in these silos, right? And we think we understand this particular, but have no idea of this other stream of other people's identities, and the important work of connecting, to talk to each other, to be humble and deep listening to the work and the experiences of other people, and to start breaking those walls. Again, I think the theme of wall keeps on coming up to me, of how do we continue to do that with radical love.
Thank you. Thank you for those responses. Another question that someone asked was, how first-generation women in ministry reflect on their experiences versus those of us in later generations? How do you think about that?
This one is a bit challenging, and so I can speak as a first generation Ethiopian American. If the question is how we reflect on our experiences, I think that yeah, I really love the community that I grew up in. I love the values that I was taught in terms of patriarchy. I came from a Protestant Christian family and background and church experience that was definitely inspired by, missionaries and such. And so there was the theology was definitely inspired by evangelical Christianity and traditional American views of patriarchy and such. However, I also experienced that there was a lot of empowered women in my church and congregation. There wasn't women pastors, but there were women elders. There were women preaching, teaching, in leadership. And when I was a young person, very excited about ministry and my role in it, I felt very empowered. It's hard and supported. Never was restricted from any way that I wanted to serve. I was always supported. Um, yes, and so it's hard for me to answer those of us in later generations. I'm not sure what those experiences are, but I can just share from my experience.
I'll say two things because I agree. I mean, this is challenging on a couple of fronts. I'll say one of the gifts of this group and any group where we're seeking to do deep ministry together is the intergenerationality of what we're doing. For a long time. She just finished her term with us. Linda was an older woman who, like, the wisdom that we get from older women, and then, like, Abby checks us all the time, and it's like, wait a minute, we ain't thinking about this, and and the ways that we need to be thinking about how we are learning from each other in all kinds of different ways is really, really important. And so I come to this question challenged by kind of the what seems like just the structures of generations where I'm it may look different how we're showing up in formal positions right now, but like women in many generations before us have been working to disrupt systems in all kinds of different ways, and it has looked different. So the system may look like it looks right now, and we are showing up in specific roles and positions, but the generations before us were women who were deeply courageous. And for me, I have been inspired by women who weren't necessarily in roles that had fancy titles, but were showing up in really deep and rich ways that inspired how I am showing up and how I learned to show up. And so it's about how do we keep learning and how do we bring those lessons along with us into the work that we are doing, no matter what corner or circle ways we needed to learn from those different generations. So just making sure that we are collecting wisdom from all around us and that we're paying attention to it, whether it's like intra-system or out of it. Like it's all lessons for us to gather.
Yeah. I think the only thing that I would add is I think for some of the people who have gone and paved the way for us, I think as a younger generation, we need to acknowledge their work. I think sometimes we just kind of the deep acknowledgement. I don't know. I don't know if it's a Mennonite church kind of thing, but acknowledgement is so important, and honoring their work, though it may, like we have already named, that it may look different, but acknowledging the work that they've done the best that they could in their generation, and to celebrate that work, I think is something that we need to do as a denomination. And then also to listen deeply into the younger women, the voices of younger people, because they've got such deep wisdom. And I think instead of maybe some of us who are older kind of hunkering down and saying that we got it now, like we have it all figured out, really giving them space and a platform to speak, whether that is in a formal setting or informal setting, connecting them with other brilliant young minds or brilliant older women theologians like Wilma Bailey, and connecting them to say that these are questions that have been wrestled with for a long time, and that there are some wise people that we need to be in relationship with, not just read books, but like deep relationships with. And in those, over coffee, those are when the wisdom spills over and we are writing, recording, taking mental notes. And I think when I see that happening, I feel like there's hope in the church.
Thank you. I remember being part of a intergenerational conversation on restorative justice a number of months ago, and I was the oldest one in that. I was at that end of the intergenerational conversation, and I remember one of the younger women saying, now, this is not like a passing of the baton. We're not asking for that. Like, we have to all be in it together. It's not like, okay, I've done this part, now you do that part. We still need each other. I think it's how you all talked about, like, we need voices. We need those intergenerational voices, because we bring such different experiences, and that's what I think enriches us all and helps us to carry the load of the work, because of whether it's experience or ideas that might be very different than the way we tried it, to say, well, it's not going to work because we tried that. No, it's going to work differently. It's going to look different. And so how we, I think, pay attention to that in this work is it's not any different. It's and that was one of the follow-up questions, is someone asked how we might imagine the intentional intergenerational spaces during the summit. And I think we have thought very intentionally about that we want to do that intergenerational work. And we have a few more minutes if you all want to talk about that. I will just say that what I'm most looking forward to is we put in this fishbowl activity where we particularly will be inviting people from different decades of life to join this fishbowl activity. And we want to have conversations around, and that one particularly, we always want to have we talk about these conversations. Can we talk about menopause? Can we talk about perimenopause? It's all of those things. And how do we do that around body image, And so we're including that as part of our conversation together that I think can be very important because that's how we are in God's image. And so what does that mean for each of us? We don't really have those conversations as often as I think we could. So that's one area that I'm certainly looking forward to. But other ways that you want to think about how we're paying attention to that intergenerational aspect.
I know that we have a is it a monologue or how to, Lorraine, Michelle
The
Armstrong.
one woman storytelling.
Woman storytelling. I think that is one way that we are telling stories of our ancestors and an important person in the Mennonite Church. Some of you know Michelle Armstrong and just the way that she can bring it on. And it will be like bringing that piece. And then we also have panelists of all ages interacting like this and having these kinds of conversations. I think we're very intentional about welcoming. And I think even with our steering committee, we have been more intentional about bringing in more younger voices into this group as well. And so that actually reflects in the things that we plan.
Well, I want to provide opportunity just as we close for just final thoughts that each of you may have just from our time together, or any word that you want to leave participants with as we think about whether it's women in leadership in general or thinking about the summit. Just a final word from each of you before we leave. How about if we start with Abby and then Shannon and Sue?
That works. That works. I think my final word is I hope you come. I hope you practice the intergenerationality by inviting folks in a generation older or a generation younger than you, so that we can all share this experience together. And yeah, and I hope that this is the time where we connect to one another, but also plan to continue the connection and maintain connection for the future.
I'll add to what Abby has shared. There's such a ease in like feeling the fatigue of the world right now, and like wanting to just, lean back in our own corners and try to get this figured out by ourselves. And whether that's our individual lives, our families, or even our churches. I think what I want to urge us to remember is that it is in who we are as a collective church that we get the closest to the fullness of God, that God shows up in so many important ways when we come together from our different voices. And so it's in our coming together that we see the sacred work of God in so many rich ways. And so the ways that we have to overcome what is really real fatigue, and just the burden of getting to a place at a certain time is the invitation for us to know that there is something sacred waiting in who we become together. So just a reminder that it's in our togetherness, in our fullness, in the ways we show up differently that we find God.
Well, thank you. Thank you for all who joined us. Thank you to each of our panelists who, thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for what you bring to us and our group and to the church. I also just want to, in closing, just to be sure that, just to let you know, for the latest news and events from MCUSA, you can subscribe to Piecemeal, MCUSA's weekly e-newsletter. You can also, I think in the chats, there will be some other links to women in leadership and to convention, to everything you could want to know. Hopefully it's there. But certainly if you have any other questions, you can reach out to me, you can reach out to steering committee members. But we do hope to see you at convention. We hope to see you at the summit. And again, there's a follow-up webinar on April 24th, again at 2 o'clock Eastern time, if you want to join to hear more about the summit and hear from some of our panelists who will also be joining us for the day. But thank you. Thank you for each of you again for taking the time and for being with us. And we look forward to being together in person. Take care.
Welcome to it. Take care.